If you're ever at a dinner party with a bunch of first-year seminary students and conversation's getting a little bit dull or boring, and you really want to find a way to spice up the conversation in the room, just ask the group what they think about allegory as a means of biblical interpretation. As far as interpretive method goes, allegory is just about as controversial as they come. People fall into different camps, and they might find allegory to be very helpful, very illuminating. Some people think it's very dangerous, and we need to stay away from it at all costs. It's one of those topics that's a little bit polarizing in the world of theology and biblical studies. But what exactly is allegory? What is allegorical interpretation of Scripture? Well, from an etymological perspective, we're thinking about the Greek word allegoria. Now, this is a compound word. The first is the adjective allos, meaning other, like some kind of other thing. And then the second part from the verb agoriuo, if you're using an Erasmian pronunciation, or agorevo, if you're using modern pronunciation. Here, we're thinking about delivering a public address, about speaking in public. So this is a cognate word of the word agora. Think of the marketplace. So to deliver a public address, presumably in the agora. Um, so allos agoriuo, allegoria, in the compound form, means something like to speak otherwise, or other speak. It's to be using words to say one thing, um, but then they actually have some sort of different meaning than the literal sense they seem to have on the surface. In their great book, Sanctified Vision, O'Keefe and Reno have a just wonderful chapter about allegory in the book. Super helpful. I would recommend everybody pick that up and read it. But let me read O'Keefe and Reno's definition of allegory, of allegorical interpretation. Allegories are basically interpretations that claim that the plain or obvious sense of a given text is not the true meaning, or at least not the full meaning. The words, events, and characters, so the allegorist claims, stand for something else. They speak for another reality, another realm of meaning. The trick, then, is to decode the true or extended meaning and translate the literal sense into its allegorical sense. Or, to change metaphors, allegorical interpretation reads like a map. The ordered reality of the text exists not for its own sake, but for the sake of guiding our thoughts onto the topography of something else, something more real and more important. All that to say, allegorical interpretation of a text is when you read a text that seems to have one literal, plain reading of the text. And an allegorical interpretation claims that actually it means something else than that literal meaning. It could include the literal meaning and mean something more and deeper, or it could mean something totally different altogether. Both are possible. O'Keefe and Reno outline three primary uses or modes of allegorical interpretation. Let's tackle each of them. First, there is using allegory to make meaning out of nonsense. O'Keefe and Reno point to the Don McLean song American Pie, one of the all-time great American songs. They point out that on the surface, if you listen to this something like 8-minute long song, uh, if you listen to this song, a long, long time ago, I can still remember how the music used to make me smile. And you listen to this song about the day the music died, and you hear about all these interesting figures, a gesture in a coat, Satan laughing with delight, sergeants playing a marching tune. And if you just try to listen to the song and map out a literal narrative or literal meaning of the words, there's no coherent meaning. Like it's nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense. Um, what we need is another mode of interpretation to recognize that the literal words of the text, whether it be the jester or Satan or the sergeants playing a marching tune, um, or the day the music died, these all mean something else, or at least something more than the literal meanings of those words. And if you do your digging, you could look on some online forums. This is actually about the death of Buddy Holly and the sort of decade of rock music. that followed his death. So we've got references to the Beatles. We've got references to Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, Janis Joplin, all of these contemporary figures that, oh yeah, you can see how sort of the image that they're paired with makes sense. But the literal meaning of the text of the song is totally incoherent. What we need is some sort of allegorical interpretation in order to add cohesion, in order to have some sort of coherent meaning of the song. Now, ancient patristic interpreters also did this with the Bible. It's not just for rock and roll music. Most famously, probably, is the creation account in Genesis. Now, there's a whole bunch we could talk about, but here, one of the more interesting parts. On the first day of creation, God creates light. Famously, God says, "Let there be light," and the narrator says, "And there was light, and there was morning, and there was evening, the first day." Well, that's all nice and well, but when we get to day 4, God then creates the sun and the moon and the stars, presumably the sources of light, right? How do we have light in the world if we don't have the sun, moon, and stars? And maybe, you could work your way around this and say it was some generic light that was not attached to the heavenly bodies. That's all fine and well. Another problem arises, though. We are talking about morning and evening. We're talking about day 1, day 2, and day 3, and so on. These categories of time are marked by the rising and the setting of the sun. Like they, as units of measurement of time or as indicators of time, they assume the existence and the activity of the sun. They presuppose it by their very essence. Now, plenty of early Christian interpreters read this and noticed this, and they saw the difficulty with it. Uh, St. Augustine, for example, he reads this sort of difficulty with light being on day 1 and sun, moon, and stars being on day 4. And Augustine, he sort of brings in this spiritual reading of the text. O'Keefe and Reno describe St. Augustine's interpretive approach, his allegorical approach here. The reference to day and night on the first day should be understood spiritually. Where Genesis 1 verses 4 and 5 tells that God separated the light from the darkness and called the light day and the darkness night, according to Augustine, we are not to founder on the literal sense. The night of the first day signifies our personal fall into sin, while the morning signifies our renewal and restoration in and through the light of spiritual truth. Thus, Augustine reads the odd problems of light and sun, day and night, in the creation account as pushing the reader toward the standard patristic narrative of creation, fall, and redemption. So, Augustine would say these references to day and night, all of this kind of thing, it's not actually about the literal day and night. This is pointing to spiritual realities about creation, fall, and redemption. Now, that's not the literal meaning of the text. That's not what those words mean. People, debate the exact meaning of the Hebrew word yom for day, whether that means a period of time or a 24-hour day or can be taken figuratively, whatever. Um, However you parse that out, it doesn't mean this. It doesn't mean what Augustine is saying here. He's saying, in an allegorical sense, this means it's saying one thing, but it means another. In this sort of meaning, he arrives there in order to make this text coherent, in order to resolve what to him seems to be nonsensical in the text. The second form of allegory that O'Keefe and Reno identify is a method that adds to the literal sense of the text, often some sort of spiritual meaning of the text. Here, the authors point to Gregory of Nyssa and his great work, The Life of Moses. Gregory talks about the life of Moses, and he refers to sort of two levels of meaning in the story of Moses' life. First, I mean, there's the literal sort of surface level meaning of the story, right? If you read Exodus, for example, Moses is born among God's people when they're in slavery in Egypt. He has his, dealings as a young adult. He flees Egypt. He comes back. He works out this deliverance for God's people. He leads them through the Red Sea to Sinai, the wilderness, all of this kind of thing. For Gregory, this is all true, right? This happened. He takes the text at face value there. This is the literal, the first meaning of the text. But Gregory would say we shouldn't stop there. There's a second, a deeper meaning of the text, a spiritual level of reading the text. Gregory finds in Moses' life sort of this mapping for the spiritual journey to God, right? The movement from slavery to liberation, to finding how to live life in the presence of God. And for Gregory, then, I mean, this isn't just a list of a narrative of things that happened way, way back in the past. This is a story that teaches us and has very real meaning for Christians of his day and any day of how to live a life of Christian practice. When Gregory, for example, reads the story of Moses encountering the burning bush, and the voice from the bush says, "Remove your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground." Gregory is really interested in the sandals here and what they mean, right? Obviously, sandals are things that go on your feet, and you wear them to walk around. But for Gregory, there's a deeper spiritual meaning there. Gregory thinks back to Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden when God makes for Adam and Eve the garments of animal skin, like clothing, covering, which is connected to their shame, their sin, their nakedness, which is not acceptable in the sight of God. The coverings of the Garden of Eden, they cover up the inappropriate things for Adam and Eve. O'Keefe and Reno note, relying on Genesis 3:21, where God is depicted as making garments of skin with which to cover the fallen Adam and Eve. Gregory interprets the sandals, or coverings of skin, as a code phrase for the body of sinful desires that clothe our lives. Thus, Gregory's allegorical interpretation of the narrative of Moses shows us that our carnal desires make it difficult for us to correctly perceive God. Sandaled feet cannot ascend. Therefore, we can dwell in rays of divine light only if we adopt the spiritual disciplines that tear away the hindering coverings of carnal desires that shroud the inner beauty of our rational souls. Well, is this what Exodus is talking about when it talks about the sandals? Remove your sandals to Moses. Um, in a literal sense, probably not. Uh, but when Gregory is reading this text and trying to identify a way to make it applicable for Christians of his day, he makes a really interesting move here to talk about spiritual disciplines, to connect it back to Adam and Eve and the garments that they have in the Garden of Eden. What he's doing is he's creatively finding a way to make this little detail applicable and relevant for the Christian life. Again, this sort of allegorical interpretation does not deny the literal sense. Gregory is not denying that Moses heard a voice that said to take off his sandals and took off his literal sandals. But he is adding that there is a deeper spiritual sense to the text. I mean, Christian interpreters, preachers do this all the time, right? Think about if you've ever heard the story of David and Goliath preached. Very often, one of the ways that text gets preached is, God can slay the giants in your own life. Well, in the text, I mean, Goliath is, not really just some personified evil thing, although there's some fun narrative stuff going on there that link him back to the serpent in the garden. Um, but this is a way, adding sort of a spiritual meaning to the text to make it relevant. God can slay the giants in your life. Or think of Mark chapter 4, Jesus on the Sea of Galilee with his disciples. Jesus calms the storm by speaking to it. Preachers often say Jesus can calm the storm in your life. Well, a storm in your life, talking about, a time of chaos in one's personal life, is fairly different than the literal reading of that text. But it is a spiritual reading, and it's an allegorical reading. Whether or not many modern Christian interpreters realize it, when they make those sorts of moves they're doing a kind of allegorical interpretation. Now, the third use of allegory outlined by O'Keefe and Reno is one where the interpreter explicitly contradicts the literal sense of the text. Not only do they add to it, like we saw in the previous use, they actually say the text means something different and does not mean what it literally says. So the famous example here that O'Keefe and Reno point out is the book of the Song of Songs, right? In the early Christian context, where sort of asceticism and putting off of desires was highly valued, this book that is very highly sensually charged, has all sorts of sensual language, presents a real problem for the early Christian ascetic practices, right? Can this book really be about sexual intimacy? Like, how does that square with a certain reading culture that these early Christians had? And here, early interpreters allegorize the text not just to say that there's a deeper spiritual meaning, to say that yes, it means it's this sort of love poem, and in addition, it means something else. They say no, it's not love poetry between a man and a woman. This is actually referring to the love and devotion and passion between Christ and the church. Origen is a big figure here, and he's a big figure throughout allegorical interpretation. Listen to how O'Keefe and Reno explain Origen's dealing with the Song of Songs. With this allegorical scheme for the text, Origen goes on to explain how the highly eroticized images fit in nicely within the ascetic project of the Christian life. The passionate imagery of sexual love mutates under Origen's masterful exegetical orchestration into the imagery of spiritual passion that loves God without the distractions of earthly and created things. Origen stays with the narrative details, but the meaning that emerges has lost all connection to carnal eroticism. So, Origen actually follows the literal sense of the text very closely. He analyzes all of the imagery, from body parts, from kissing, from embracing, all of this. The bosom, for example, Origen reads that, and his mind goes to John's gospel, lying in the bosom of Jesus. This is not about a man and a woman. This is actually, according to Origen in his allegorical interpretation of the book, um, it is about devotion to Christ, passion for a relationship with Christ. So here, the allegorical sense of the text is on this third and maybe sort of highest level, where the literal meaning of the text not only is insufficient, but it's not true. It is not the true meaning of the text. And this is one that often people have a really hard time with. Now, I'm not going to give my opinions here on allegory and allegorical interpretation of Scripture. Um, but I do think it's worth noting O'Keefe and Reno make this really interesting point about what allegorical interpretation says about the interpreter. Um, what they're interested in so much is not merely the interpretation of each individual component of a text, but what a broader allegorical interpretation reveals about an interpreter's sort of economy of Scripture. Like, what do they think the Bible is there for? What are their presuppositions about what it is doing? Right? Origen and Gregory and Augustine, these sorts of figures, they come to the conclusions they come to because they have broader sort of meta presuppositions about what should be there already. Like, if you think the Bible supports your ascetic view of the Christian life, of course you're going to read Song of Songs and take sort of away from any sort of centralized erotic reading of the text, more towards um, devotion to Christ. Uh, but it's actually not quite that simple. We have this sort of chicken and the egg situation. Like, um, do we read the text and find certain things in it because we have these sort of large scale propositions? Or do we have these large scale propositions because we find those things in the text? It's really difficult to say in any definitive sense. What we can say is those things are mutually reinforcing, whether you use allegorical interpretation or not. and most people do in some sense in Christian interpretation. The way that we go about that and the conclusions we come to in a text actually say a lot about what we think on a broader level about what Scripture is there for, about broader movements of meaning in the biblical story, about what we expect to find there, what we think the text must be saying. So, however we go about interpreting the Bible, it's a good exercise to ask, what are the conclusions we keep coming to over and over again on a small scale? What do those say about our, much broader scale assumptions about what the biblical text must be when we approach it? And how do those two things inform each other? If we can become people who are much more aware of those questions, I think we will go a long way just by that in becoming responsible interpreters of Scripture. Allegory often gets thrown around as a sort of boogeyman, especially in evangelical circles where we're very focused on authorial intent in historical grammatical approaches to Scripture. And I'm a New Testament PhD. My training and my interest is largely historical, grammatical, but there should be an acknowledgement that as Christian readers of Scripture who fall into these sort of Christian reading patterns of Scripture, allegorical readings are fairly present. I remember sitting in a class years ago where the professor, asked about that David and Goliath scene, where it often gets preached as, God can slay the giants in your life. And the professor asked, what do you think about that? And one student in the class who was sort of like in a more reformed PCA camp shot up his hand and said, "That's ridiculous. The David and Goliath text is not about God slaying the giants in our life. The text is about how Goliath is actually, evil personified, and Christ is the true and better David who has once and for all slain Goliath on our behalf." Um, and I think about that a lot because that's also allegorical interpretation. Um, because Christ is not literally in that text. It is a Christian reading strategy to find him there, and there are clues we might have in the New Testament to do so. But we are, in one very real sense, like we're interjecting sort of a spiritual Christological reading on top of the literal meaning of the text. So often, so many people who are the loudest critics of allegory, if they read the Old Testament Christologically, um, they're using allegory. So I just offer that as a word of caution. It's probably something we should be aware of. Some of the hard criticisms of allegory, I think, are sometimes a bit misplaced. Again, read O'Keefe and Reno. They have a great chapter on that, a great sort of introduction to allegory. I hope this was helpful.